Okay, thank you everyone for tuning in today. My name is Chuck Minguez. I'm SDR here at 121 Inc. We're very excited today to have Jim Peterson from ConnectWise to talk about mergers and acquisitions and the IT due diligence that comes along with that whole process. Jim, thank you so much for being here today. Would you mind introducing yourself and telling everyone a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Peterson from ConnectWise. If you haven't heard of ConnectWise, it's not a surprise. We're kind of on the back end of the MSP channel, and we provide software and services to great MSPs like one-to-one. My personal background is I've been a small business owner for several years, recently transitioned to ConnectWise to tell these kind of stories. I've been in the middle of large and small acquisitions, both on the being acquired side and on the acquiring side. So I understand the struggle that you go through when you're trying to either buy or sell a company.
Very great. Yeah, this is very exciting. Very nice to have you here, Jim. I will let you do your thing and I'll kind of sit back and if people pop into the chat and ask questions, I'll make sure to take some notes. And then, yeah, we'll follow back up at the end.
Sounds great.
All right.
All
Thanks,
right.
Jim.
Yeah, so just to jump into the agenda, we're going to talk about why IT due diligence is more important than ever. It's always been an important piece of any merger or acquisition, but it's becoming more and more important because of some of the threats that are out there in the world. We're going to talk about the IT time bomb, stuff that we don't see that comes up and explodes right in our world after this has happened, and some of the kind of fallout effect that we can have. Some other general typical challenges that businesses don't normally think of in the IT space and how we can get in front of those to make them not challenges, but things that help us with this process. And then just how we can help bridge the gap, both from the buyer and the seller side, to just make these as smooth as possible. They're always super stressful. They're always going down to the last minute, but what can we do to make it a little bit easier? So, and yeah, if you have questions, obviously, like Chuck said, please feel free to drop them. We can address them as we go and make sure that we're getting everything answered. All right, the importance of IT due diligence, why it matters more than ever. We're going to talk a little cybersecurity first, because that's really one of the big reasons why this is so important today. And we may use a couple terms as we're going through this conversation, like attack, incident, or breach. And just to give a little definition around that, there's millions of attacks going on all the time. We're all being attacked, whether we think we are or not. If you have an email address, you're being attacked. And most of the time, or almost all the time, those are being blocked by some technology. Now, if that technology gets past a layer of security that's meant to stop it, it's called an incident. It's bypassed something that was supposed to stop it, but it hasn't got further into the organization. Now, breach is the bad one. That means it's got past enough technology that it's actually gotten to the data. It's seen it, stole it, modified it, done something to the information inside your company. And just as we're using these terms, we may say them, but if you ever have an incident, right, we always want to say attack or incident. We never want to say breach unless someone has told us, who's authorized to tell us that we've had a breach, because it has some compliance issues behind it and it has some legal terms. So just a reminder, always use incident or attack if you don't know until someone tells you you've been breached.
That's a great point.
Yeah. So another couple little things here, and we'll just scroll right through these. We talk a lot about the value of data in an organization. And while this is almost all personal identifiable information, they have very, very different values. And when you see 1 million Social Security records be released or 1,000 medical records be released, they have real value in the real world. So this is the dark web sale of data side. There's 3 ways that bad actors typically make money from a cyber attack. They'll either ransom, which means you have to pay them to gain access to your data. They'll extort, meaning you have to pay them so they don't release your data, or they'll just do straight data sale, meaning they'll take your data and they'll sell it on the black market or the dark web and receive money for it. And you may or may not ever know. But these are some values out there. So when you hear 1 million medical records, it's a lot of money in that world. So, and just as a note, physical passport, still the king, $15,000 for a physical passport. Not that anybody should sell one, but just kind of put everything in perspective. Now, so one of the kind of digging into why this is so important, businesses have risks. Businesses have a lot of things that we're going to go into that are the IT ticking time bomb. But realistically, people that are employed in businesses also have risks. And a lot of times we separate those two. We'll say, well, that's an individual risk. But unfortunately, individual risks are really seeping their way into the business risk because of a couple common factors. First is we're enabling more bring your own device to work. So the BYOD side, I may bring my computer, my tablet, my phone into my organization, connect to the web. And now if I have malicious software on my system, it could be an infection to the whole system. So it's just things to think about from the personal side. In addition, password reuse is still rampant in the world, meaning I use the same password on LinkedIn as I use on Netflix as I use in my corporate environment. And if one of those get hacked, all of them gets hacked. So those kind of things that are hard to control from the business side find their way into the business side, whether we want them to or not. The other thing to think about is when we look at the cost of specifically of ransomware, the average payout in 2021 was roughly $300,000,
Wow.
which is a lot of money, right? None of us want to give up $300,000. Most small businesses don't have an extra 300,000 laying around that they can use just to cover the ransomware. So, but the downside of this is in 2022 that increased to over 800,000, and last year it was 1.54 million per ransomware incident. So
Wow.
as we're talking about this, we think, well, how do we protect against that being our payout? We can have cyber liability insurance, and that gets a little fuzzy when we do an acquisition because there's a lot of change going on in the environment, but just things to think about that there's some real big risk out there. Okay, so now on to data. We think of what are some challenges that happen whenever we're thinking of a merger and acquisition. If we would have rewound to maybe 15 years ago, we would have walked into a business and said, there's the servers, there's the data, we can put our arms around it, we know where everything's at. And it just isn't the case anymore. Businesses are spinning up new SaaS applications all the time. More and more data is going to Microsoft 365 or other hosted environments. And the data is just challenging to put your arms around. So knowing where all that data is a real challenge, a really tough thing, part of a merger and acquisition, because we want to make sure we know where it's at, if it's secure, and if I can recover it. It's kind of a common theme that we'll talk about a little bit throughout this. Because if they're only protecting half or a third or 2/3 of their data, it's a real risk, and especially in an acquisition state where we want to buy something, we want to buy that intellectual property, but we find out after the fact that it wasn't properly protected. So it's a big piece of this conversation. Now, getting to the time bomb, I think we've probably led up to a few of these already, just talking a little bit about some of the cyber risks. But what are some of the key concepts that we really need to know about an IT environment when we're sitting in a merger and acquisition situation? So first things first, we know that the majority of time when there's an issue, it's a people-based issue. So we think about our employees, like we talked about the BYOD and the password reuse. Well, most of the time when we're looking at an IT environment, we're going to say, well, what are the main risks? Well, typically the main risk about 80% of the time is people-based. So is the company using proper technology to protect against the most common threats? If we think of incidents, like we said, we got past a layer of technology, maybe not to the data, but past a layer of technology. 50% of the time when there's an incident, it's a credential issue. So going in and reviewing a company to say, are they using multi-factor authentication across the board? Kind of the first thing we can look at and say, that's a good thing. We can kind of assume there's a good level of protection, at least from incorrect access to the environment. We can kind of start there and say, all right, we got one base covered. It's a really important piece of trying to protect an asset that you'll be purchasing. The second one is phishing, and phishing is very common. It's, again, probably the most common style of attack, trying to get you to click a link, do something, type in a password. And we'll typically look at security awareness training and email filtering. Two other things that we want to look at, especially if we're requiring, saying, are they already using these technologies to protect their investment? And last is exploits. System patching and assessments. Are they continually patching and looking at their environment to make sure that the risks are mitigated or at least as minimal as possible? So kind of 3 check marks anytime you're going to buy a company to see where do they stand from a security structure or security posture? Are they forward thinking on security and trying to protect the environment, or are they more reactive on that side? Because it'll balance out the risk and figure out where that attention needs to be paid. Now, so big bombs, right? So those are kind of the little cybersecurity environment things that we want to talk about. The real time bombs that we'll typically see in any type of purchase are turnover, equipment, and documentation. It's estimated that roughly 30% of employees have turned over in the last 5 years. And in 2022, it was 19% of all IT professionals. And we know in the small to mid-sized organization world, the majority of information is in the employees' heads. So as those employees turn over, a lot of information is often lost. So understanding where a company is with their turnover of their IT professionals will tell you how much inherent information is still retained in that company. In addition, equipment, right? It's gone down quite a bit, which is a good thing. But in 2020, end of life equipment made up about 40% of business environments, which is a huge percentage. And we say end of life, it means it's no longer being patched, no longer being supported, and the risks that open up on that system just won't be fixed. So they become a true challenge in the environment. Now, that's decreasing since 2020, which is great with a focus on cybersecurity. But approximately 30% of all equipment is still under patched. When you look back at that patching being 9% or exploits being 9% of the risk in an environment, this is a huge open hole that we have. And it just tells you the care and feeding. If I go in and find out that we're massively under a patched in an environment, we'll get to see, well, how are they taking care of all of the equipment, not just the specific pieces that we're looking at that time. And last but not least is documentation. In a small business environment, it is historically limited. Typically, like we said, with the employees, most information will normally be in their heads, maybe some documented, but especially when we're in the acquisition or being acquired mode, the more documentation, the better. The more we can prove our environment, the easier that process, that due diligence can be. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of it just in that small to mid-sized market world, but it's something we could put a little bit of attention on and really remove that from being a time bomb. When we think of shifting to like the strategies around data protection, we throw that term around a lot just to kind of give a little bit of understanding. We have obviously the security side of it, which cybersecurity is everywhere. You probably hear way too much about what you should do for cybersecurity. And we'll say that's tools, process, and people. And I'll switch to the other side, recovery. We also hear about that all the time, the BCDR side of things, which is tools, process, and people. What we see very, very little of is actual data management. What data, where's it located? When we showed that first chart of there's data everywhere and we may only be protecting some of it, what is the important information? What's the business critical information? Do you have intellectual property, trade secrets, employee information? What is it? Where's it located? How do we secure it so only the right people can see it? And how do we be able to recover it in a method that meets the business needs? We see a lot of challenges in this area. From a cybersecurity side, we see basic challenges like configuration management, deployment, adoption, alignment, and is there a current breach? We've went into acquisitions where we found out there was an active breach going on. And you definitely pump the brakes real fast in that environment. Say we need to clean this up first because I can't acquire a breach. But it's the truth, it's what really happens. Security systems are great, tools are great, but if the process and people aren't truly aligned with best practices, you can have challenges in any of these areas. I'm going to switch over to recovery real quick because most of the time we'll be spending on management. Recovery has very similar challenges. Configuration management, deployment. Attestation, though, is something that we rarely talk about. What data do we have out in the environment that we want removed from a legal risk perspective? And a lot of times some businesses will think, well, I don't want to hide any information. But if you think about the legal holding of a lot of different business, tax, and sensitive information, we may want to remove that just from the risk that we don't want it to get released into the bad actors' hands. So making sure we're doing a recovery policy that not just protects data, but removes it when we no longer need it is a really important piece of any BCDR program. And the same thing goes with data management. That's where we have the most challenges today because they'll secure it, they'll make it recoverable, but we don't know where the data is to properly secure it or make it recovered. So as we're looking at an M&A, understanding a company that actually does good data management and can define where all that data is, how it's recovered, what its recovery points and objectives are, and then can properly protect it, it's a huge plus for an organization. Now, if we look into, so those are more the technical side, right? The internal IT structure sides. If we look at some other typical challenges that unfortunately don't get thought of enough early in the process, we have the bombs, right? The turnover equipment and documentation, but secrecy. We often see, we go into a situation where a company is going to be required or another company wants to acquire, and they don't want anybody to know. And so it's very hard at times to figure out, well, how do we get somebody in to review an IT environment when we don't want anybody to know we're coming in to review an IT environment? It's a real challenge in the M&A space. And, personally, from a personal story, I've went in as, a contractor going in to do a review of an environment just to provide some assessment information, which is misleading. It's what we have to do sometimes. It feels a little misleading, but it worked. We were able to identify some problems. But if we think about that, if we know secrecy is going to be an issue and we have to keep it confidential through the acquisition, building a process around how we acquire information, what we need, and if we're on the sales side, making sure we have that information ready to go so we can just provide it and not have to fight the secrecy battle is a really key piece of trying to avoid and bridge the gap. Another issue, and this is on the real negative side, is that oftentimes we'll go into environments and we're going to really dig under the covers and try to figure out what's going on. And we may have IT professionals that are nervous because it's an acquisition. They're concerned about the deployments they've done, maybe their own skills, and they conceal information. So to get to the truth of the matter, it can be a challenge in any M&A acquisition process. The next is similar to concealment. It's just we didn't know, right? We're doing things that just are incorrect. And so it can be a little bit of a challenge in that world. And we may not know how to provide information, or we may just be plain wrong. We may say, yes, we're doing MFA everywhere when we're just doing it on 365 or some other environment, and we're giving incorrect information, misleading a little bit out of ignorance, not out of malice. And last is timeline. And this is going to be not a surprise. We've been in many situations, again, personally, where the acquisition is a week out and they're getting ready to send IT in. And you have to do your full assessment, make recommendations, identify risks in a very, very condensed time frame, which leads to some real challenge in accuracy and effectiveness of the reports. So bridging that gap, right? That's probably the biggest issue and the biggest challenge. The things we can do to bridge the gap. So that you can avoid paying less than you need to. From the buyer perspective, it's pretty straightforward. And we'll go into these and we'll probably spend a little bit of time on these. Minimum standards. If we think of being on the buyer side, when we talk about the cybersecurity pieces that are really important in the environment, we can fill out that minimum standards list. And it may be we require these 5 types of technologies. We require these processes to be already in use. And we need to get documentation on the effectiveness or the check-ins of those processes. This can significantly help. Now, this is unfortunately the side of IT driving the merger and acquisition side, but it really can avoid any incorrect purchase or buying a risk that we didn't know was coming. We can define those standards of these are the solutions we need to have in place before we'd even consider an acquisition. Now, this doesn't mean they have to be at your standards, but this is just the minimum standards before we go from a buyer's perspective. From an IT side, from an MSP side, we have the same thing. If we're an MSP and we want to take on a new MSP client, we're going to provide managed services to them. We have to have minimum standards because there's too much risk if we take on things that are below what the industry has said is safe. If we take on systems that are out of date, out of end of life, and they have a vulnerability, it can come back on the managed service provider as their responsibility to have protected against that when there's nothing we can do. So thinking about it from a purchase side can really help decide whether that's the right type of organization for you. The second part of that is, so we're going to have our minimum standards, and let's say they check the box in all the minimum standards. What's the assessment process that you're going to want a business to go through whenever you're looking from an IT perspective, whenever we're going to do a merger and acquisition, defining all this. And if you've done this, if you've done a merger and acquisition 5, 10, 20 times, this is probably part of your game. If you're on your first or second, it may be pretty new to understand that we need a network security and vulnerability assessment of everything in their environment. This is going to tell us a really important story on the risk that we're purchasing. Now, you may just be doing an asset purchase instead of, and keeping the liabilities at bay, but still, once you own that data and once you own the equipment, you then will hold the risk of that equipment. So doing a full assessment, making sure that we're checking these off and you're getting to the seller early. These are the things that we're going to need to move forward, the minimum standards and the assessment process. You can avoid a lot of that secrecy. You can avoid a lot of that time crunch, those kind of challenges in there that maybe even the concealment and the ignorance if we ask for the right people to do the network and security and vulnerability assessment. Now, from the seller side, this is where we have a real interesting issue because we said on the seller side, documentation is a real challenge. If you're looking to sell in the next couple of years, we'll say 2 years, taking the time to fully document your IT environment will significantly decrease the due diligence piece of it. If you can identify all the equipment, its age, its current patching status, who's working on it, who has rights to it, if you can fully document that and provide it, you can significantly reduce the risk and the due diligence side from the buyer because you're going to have that minimum standards, you're going to have that assessment process already created. And that kind of leads us into the second one. If you're getting ready to jump into this process, continual network, continual security, and continual vulnerability assessments, quarterly, annually, whatever your business can kind of handle or stomach in that process without overdoing it, will just allow them to provide the documentation right away, make sure you're safe, and make this process, avoid basically any time bombs that you may be presenting to the buyer. So how does that look from a security side? Now, kind of back into the cyber conversation, because really cybersecurity, data management, and data recovery are the three areas that most acquisitions are going to focus on. Are you protected? Do you manage your data well? And can you recover it if you need to? When we look at what a layered defense looks like, or defense in depth, we'll say, hey, that includes multiple technologies. Now, this likely isn't going to be your specific stack or your specific software requirements. But when we think of that incident versus breach, if we bypass one of these layers of technology, the goal in all of this is that another layer of technology picks it up and stops it from getting all the way through to the data. As an example, I get a link in an email and I click it because I'm tired. It's 10 o'clock at night. Chuck forwarded me something and I'm like, oh, I'm just going to see what it is real quick. And it was an incorrect link, or it was a bad link, or it was a good link and it got changed on the back end to be a malicious link, which happens after time. My hope is that the DNS and web filtering would kick up and stop that from getting out to the internet, or that my SIM and SOC would notice it, or that my security awareness training would finally click in and I'd raise my hand and say, hey, IT, I clicked a link. I know a couple of years ago we used to get yelled at about this, and now we get celebrated when we raise our hands. So it's just a way of stopping it at the worst case to be an incident. Now, we would typically say business continuity, disaster recovery was the last line of defense. And I haven't said it yet, but we'll say this quite often. We always want to be in control of our own restoration. Any business who's either acquiring or being acquired, if they will always have control of restoration, you can trust that they've built a solution that will protect the data. Unfortunately, in our world, cybersecurity insurance has come in and taken over that new line of defense because we know that the bad actors want to attack our BCDR solutions. So a couple additional things to look at that we didn't put on for time bombs are, do you have immutable storage for your backup or your BCDR solution? Is it protected? Is it impossible for the bad actor to delete that data? It allows you to just maintain that control if we ever needed to restore. Now, getting into a few of these technologies, just in a little bit of detail, we'll fly through this and then we'll jump to questions. But if you're a little unfamiliar with some of the technologies that were in that layer, managed detection and response, it's just that front end piece that goes on laptops and desktops and on servers that stops known and unknown threats from attacking the network or your PC. AV was the term we used for a long time, antivirus, but unfortunately that just stopped known threats. So if it was unknown, it would open up and go. So a crypto locker virus is a good example. Not necessarily unknown because it could be a brand new day one virus, but the activity it did, it started encrypting files. Antivirus didn't know that that was a problem, so it would just let it go. But MDR, managed detection and response, which is a bigger subset of endpoint detection and response, would say, I don't like that activity. It shouldn't be doing it. Let's stop it and then revert it back to where it was. So And the difference between managed detection and response and endpoint detection and response is that security operations center. MDR is a little bit higher in the stack because it gives 24/7, 365 visibility and management of that system. So when I click that link at 12 o'clock at night, and I shouldn't have, if it kicks off our MDR, they'd be watching it and making sure we're protected. Security awareness training, and we talk a lot about security awareness training. A lot of businesses still don't use it. It's one of the most important things to stop threats and stop bad actors from getting into our environment. If we're aware, if we're suspicious of activities, we can stop that attack right away. I used to put a really basic example of a bad email up, but we've changed it out for an AI created email. So that education and testing helps us identify real risks in the world. If you see this email, well, it's actually pretty crafty because it has Karen Lynch's information, her actual signature. A lot of people use CVS. It's to Curtis, which is the actual recipient of this message, and it looks as legit as any real email. So being suspicious of this kind of thing will help you understand not to click the link, and infect your machine. Multi-factor authentication, well, most people know what this is, but we'll kind of, we want to validate that you are who you said you are. When we think of that password reuse as a risk in an acquisition, because if there's a breach, if there's an issue, and if it's just one form of authentication, it can, especially with password reuse, it can become a real problem very fast, especially with business email compromise. So the secondary challenge, right, saying you tried to log into the system, let me challenge you with a text, an email, a phone call, some other sort of authentication. Let me check to make sure you're really who you said you are. And I respond to that, then I can get in, and only then I can get in. It is dramatically reduces that 49% of issues coming from credentials down to 1 to 2%. When we think about, so that's kind of on the cybersecurity or the securing side. When we think of the recovery side, if you're going into an acquisition, you're being acquired, one kind of standard, a gold standard from the MSP side that we would talk about is 3-2-1, 3 copies of your data on 2 different medias, 1 being offsite. We had a plus in there because without proper configuration, that immutable storage as an example, none of it matters. You could have 10 copies of the data, but if they're just sitting on your network with all the rest of your data and a bad actor gets in, they'll delete, encrypt, change, modify all those backups, and they become unusable. So we want to make sure it's configured properly. And how that looks in the real world is our production, local and offsite. First thing, we get that geographic distance between our offsite backup and our production and local environment. This significantly helps us be able to restore if we had a fire or some other natural disaster or equipment failure. This used to be hard. It's really easy now. Everybody's got offsite storage. It's 100 miles away, so you can throw it to the internet. The big question we'll get to the end is, can it perform the way we need it to if we had to do a restoration? But one of the challenges we'll have is, when we just have those 5 pieces of equipment that we back up, it's easy to grow the backup environment. Because if a file gets added, it automatically gets a local backup, it automatically gets offsite backup. When we add SaaS applications, it becomes a little more of a challenge. So M365 or Microsoft 365 is a good example. We want to do a SaaS backup on that so that we can recover it in a 3-2-1 configuration anytime we want. We have the structure right, we have the historical data right that matches our business needs, and we can recover it ourselves. Again, we're in control of our recovery, not somebody else. Now, getting to that proper configuration, if there were to be a breach on the production network, which we obviously don't want, immutable storage will help protect those backups. So again, we can recover our own data when we want to, when we need to. And then that performance is the last piece. If our maximum tolerable downtime, or if the acquiring company's maximum tolerable downtime is 8 hours, but we find out that recovery could take 96 hours, we have a mismatch and we might need to change our configuration a little bit. So back to that last piece, right? So if we think about an M&A side, a couple of the technologies that we want to put in that checkbox to say, yes, we have a really good solution here. If we think of EDR, MDR, we're protecting the front end of the PCs against known and unknown threats. Multi-factor authentication, we're ensuring that that business is validating who is authenticating with it and getting access to data. Security awareness training, that they're suspicious all the time. SIM and SOC is a great addition because if there's a current breach, again, we have to just be aware of this. SIEM and SOC, that's its job to pick up a breach in the middle of a breach. So if they have SIEM and SOC deployed and it's properly working, the way we want it to, you can have a high confidence that it's very unlikely that they have a breach going on that's active. And BCDR, if they have a great BCDR solution that they're testing, again, I would request the results of their most recent BCDR test to see how it went. But if they're in control of the recovery, you're in a really good space. And now just our little graphic here that we like to go through. If you're ever worried about what happens when a bad actor hits an environment, if you're prepared, or the company you're going to acquire, or if you're going to be acquired, if you're ready for it and you get a fake email attack, your security awareness is going to kick in. If there's a password theft out there, your multi-factor authentication is going to kick in. If you have general exploits, you have old equipment, if you're part of that 30% of machines that are under patch in a business environment, our SIEM and SOC and patching are going to be there to help support and make sure that you're protected as much as possible. Data ransom, always a fear. BCDR, we're going to be in control of our recovery at all times. And the last one, we didn't touch on this a lot, but we said ransom, extortion, and data sale are the three paths for the bad actors. If we had an extortion situation, we would leverage what's called access management. You'll hear of zero trust and other things in probably future presentations, but we want to make it so bad actors can't get to the data that they shouldn't get to, even if they breach the network. And that's it. Lots of information in a kind of a fast pass. So hopefully that's hitting everybody, giving them a good understanding of some of the challenges with merger and acquisitions from the IT perspective.
Jim, that was really fantastic. A lot of great information. A quick question for you. From the buyer's perspective, for somebody who may be doing this for the first time ever, do you have any tips or tricks on how to approach some of these kind of maybe challenging questions or conversations around how the company is protecting their data and how to get a look at their IT environment?
Yeah, no, I think there's probably two areas of this. There's one, the preparation of any acquisition. So getting that documentation early, like I said, that, hey, here's our minimum state. Here's what we're looking for from your IT environment. Let us know what you have and don't have of this in this environment. Right. Then it's going to come down to, I mean, we have to do is a big word, but we really, really need to consider true assessments. To go in and visually inspect equipment is great from an asset side, but we need to make sure all that configuration or all that equipment is configured properly. So having someone who does true network and security assessments, vulnerability assessments, come in and check that equipment to make sure there are no risks. I mean, I think the short answer is have that be part of the checklist on the acquisition, that this is part of due diligence, get it out there early so they're aware of it. Right. And then we got to follow through. It's like project postmortems. We got to do it every time on every project.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And wanted to open it up. Darren, do you have any questions that you would like to ask?
I do. Thank you, Chuck.
Yeah.
So Jim, thank you for all that information. It was very good. I was diligently taking some notes there, but I assume we're going to get a copy of this so we can review it. So that's great too.
Absolutely.
In addition to what you've spoken about, it was a lot about the data and the protection of it and how to make sure that you're verifying that all things are going to go well. My question is, when it comes to data, and you specifically being with ConnectWise, a buyer that's using ConnectWise, going in and buying or acquiring someone that is not necessarily on ConnectWise, can you talk a little bit about how that process goes and how easy or hard that can be?
Yeah, that's good. So this interesting conversation, if I think of specifically the ConnectWise owned products, and I'll kind of verse that by ConnectWise products that they resell. I'll really focus on the ConnectWise owned products like PSA, Managed, CPQ. Sorry for all the acronyms, right? But yeah, I'd say that there's a difference. I'll start with configuration, right? At the end of the day, especially if this is an IT company buying an IT company, which I kind of say that sounds like what we're talking about here. Little things matter a lot, because if we look at agreement setup, if we look at, billing processes, if we look at all those things, those are where things really start to fall apart, whether it's a ConnectWise to ConnectWise or ConnectWise to another PSA. Aligning those billing configurations. If we look at agreement setup specifically, that's probably the biggest challenge, because we're all going to have clients, we're all going to have team members, we're all going to have contacts in there, which is kind of the other piece of specifically PSA. Agreements are where it gets easy or hard, and it doesn't matter if it's it doesn't matter if it's a spreadsheet or if it's PSA. So I hope that answers your question on that piece. RMM, maybe even CPQ. What we see is there's less merger on that and more roll to. So even RMM to RMM, our team, ConnectWise can help with that migration, but a lot of times, unfortunately, we see just re-onboarding, right? Hey, let's pull and reload the system. That way we get all of a clean install, all the alerting suppressed that needs to be suppressed in the way we do things. So, and again, I don't think that really matters a whole lot between whether it's ConnectWise RMM and another RMM. We're typically going to do that process on the tech side.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, some great questions. I think we're probably good unless anyone else has any other questions. Mike, Darren, anything else you wanted to ask?
Let me just take a look here. Yes, one more question. From your perspective, Jim, and the experience that you've had with these M&As, do you find it more valuable to have someone within your own organization, again, when looking at an acquisition, to do most of this due diligence in-house from what they can do based on comparing it to how we do things compared to what our minimum standards will accept, which is what you mentioned earlier. And then outside of that, do you know of third parties that are really good at this that you might want to consider to help with this process?
Yeah. So first things first, I would want someone on my team. I would recommend, and we see the best results when it's someone on our team that knows our business well, knows how we operate, to do the evaluation, because they can easily quickly spot, hey, they're doing this thing differently than we are, and it's either a danger or hey, maybe it's an improvement. There's I think that's you're spot on with that. So doing it internally when possible is one of the best answers. Then I probably get to size of the deal. Not that that's the most important thing, but a $5 million MSP buying a $3 million MSP, an individual can do that assessment typically pretty well. If we started getting into the big digits, we're probably talking, I don't want to say like a big four assessment, but we're going to need likely someone from, and I don't have a specific recommendation, someone from an assessment house that does this for a living, for a merger and acquisition assessment. We'd probably look at that front. But again, we're talking, that's got to be a pretty large deal to afford someone to come in for that type of engagement.
Okay. Thank you for that insight.
Yeah.
Yeah, some great questions. Yeah, thank you, Jim, again for being here today. I really appreciate it. Do you want to shout out your LinkedIn so people can connect with you if they have additional questions?
Yeah, if you want to connect on LinkedIn, please feel free to direct message me. I'm just Jim Peterson 3 at the LinkedIn. So
perfect, great. Yeah, and I will make sure we'll get this presentation out to everyone who joined us today, and we'll get this up live as well on the website. Jim, thank you again so much for being here. I really appreciate it. There was a lot of great information and a lot of value in what you talked about today.
All right, thank you very much for letting me present. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim, and enjoy the rest of the day.
All right, you as well.